Imagine waking up tomorrow, grabbing your phone, and the first news alert you see is that oil has just hit $200 a barrel.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a terrifying thought.
Right, and then you see that global shipping insurance has just, completely evaporated overnight. So cargo ships are just totally frozen in port. Inflation is spiking literally by the hour.
Just a complete global standstill.
Exactly. And then the wildest part, that the United States military is suddenly dusting off a word we really haven't heard in, 50 years? Conscription. The draft.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of scenario that sounds like the plot of a dystopian thriller.
It really does.
But the mechanics of how we could actually get there are surprisingly and, frankly, terrifyingly plausible.
And that is exactly what we're unpacking on today's deep dive. We're looking at this deeply complex, incredible high-stakes roadmap of global conflict.
It's a dense one today.
It is.
Yeah.
We have a really fascinating transcript in front of us. It's an interview between a geopolitical analyst, Glenn Deason, and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Right. And Wilkerson isn't just an outside observer. He served as chief of staff to the U.S. Secretary of State.
Exactly. So we are looking at an analysis from someone who has, literally been inside the room where these massive, grand strategic decisions are made.
Which gives it a totally different weight. We're getting an inside perspective on the actual machinery of these conflicts.
Yeah, and the premise of this source material is this theoretical, but highly detailed, extended U.S. military conflict with Iran under a Trump administration.
But it's vital to point out, it's not just a military breakdown.
Right.
It's an examination of the massive cascading global ripple effects that this kind of conflict would trigger.
And before we really get into the weeds here, I do want to establish some, let's call them rules of engagement for you listening right now.
That's a good idea, yeah.
Because we were looking at some highly politically charged claims today. This involves the U.S., Israel, Iran, and our job on this deep dive is absolutely not to take a side.
Right. We are strictly neutral here.
Completely.
Yeah.
We aren't here to endorse these viewpoints or, litigate the politics or champion any specific narrative, whether it leans left, right, or anything in between.
We are purely acting as your guides. We're just here to unpack the claims, the analysis, and those warnings exactly as they are presented in this specific source material.
Exactly. Think of this as us just reverse engineering a geopolitical blueprint.
And if you are out there wondering, why should I care about some theoretical war game, it's because this is a blueprint for how your everyday life could just be completely upended.
Right. It hits home.
It does. If the scenarios outlined in this text were to actually unfold, it fundamentally rewrites the global economic order. I mean, it affects the purchasing power of your savings, the supply chains that deliver your electronics, your medicine.
Cost of gas to get to work.
Exactly. Your physical security and just the entire structure of the world you live in.
So any major military conflict, before it becomes about grand strategy or, ideology, it starts with dirt. It starts with physical geography.
From water, yeah.
Right. And the source material kicks off with this really stark assessment regarding the administration's posture. It claims that while U.S. leadership might want, or at least expect, a quote-unquote short war with Iran, geography and tactical reality make a short war literally impossible.
Yeah, the source argues the U.S. is locked into this all-or-nothing position.
And the text highlights this quote from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz to really frame this dynamic. The quote is, "To win, Iran needs only not to lose. To win, the U.S. and Israel need a spectacular victory."
Which is just a massive tactical asymmetry.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, break that down for us. Why does that dictate the entire flow of this theoretical war?
Well, think about it from the perspective of the invading force. If you are attacking and looking for regime change or the total dismantling of a nation's military capability, a messy stalemate is functionally a defeat for you.
Because you didn't achieve the goal.
Exactly. You carry the burden of total success.
Mm.
Iran, on the other hand, is playing defense on its home turf. They don't have to march on Washington. They just have to survive. They just need to absorb those initial kinetic strikes and keep functioning just enough to bleed the attacker dry.
Basically make it a war of attrition that the attacker's public back home just won't support anymore.
Exactly. And to achieve that spectacular victory, to actually topple the adversary, the U.S. would theoretically need boots on the ground, a full land invasion.
But the analysis here is that a massive ground invasion is a complete geographical delusion.
A total non-starter.
I have a hard time visualizing that, honestly, because we always hear about the sheer logistical might of the U.S. military, right? the ability to project power anywhere on the globe. Why is an amphibious assault or a ground invasion simply off the table here?
Well, you have to look at a topographic map of Iran. It is essentially a natural fortress.
Okay.
You have the Zagros Mountains to the west and the south. You've got the Elburz Mountains to the north, and these incredibly harsh, unforgiving deserts in the interior.
So you can't just roll a column of tanks across it like it's an open plain.
Not at all. And the source is very specific here. It claims there's really only one prospective landing place of any strategic value in the entire country.
Just one.
Just one, and that is Karg Island. The text even notes that many Persians refer to it almost mythologically as the Forbidden Isle.
The Forbidden Isle. Wow. So what makes Karg Island the sole exception to this massive mountain fortress?
It's all about its specific coastal geography. It's surrounded by incredibly deep water.
How deep are we talking?
Deep enough that they can load 10 massive supertankers simultaneously.
Oh, wow. That's huge.
It is the absolute pulsing heart of Iran's oil export industry. It is essential to their economy, and ironically, it's also essential to the economies of neutral nations like India that purchase all that oil.
So it's the ultimate strategic target. But if it's the only viable entry point, the element of surprise is basically zero.
Right, exactly. You might be able to fight your way onto Karg Island and establish a tiny foothold, with a Marine Expeditionary Force. But the source states unequivocally that any other landing zone in the country would result in the immediate destruction of U.S. forces.
Because there's no viable beachhead for, like, a Normandy-style land invasion.
Right. The terrain just completely forces you into these lethal, narrow choke points.
And the really wild part is that the source points out this isn't just theory. The U.S. military actually already knows this because they ran the simulation.
Yes, the text references the Van Riper War Games.
Okay, let's talk about that.
So about 20 years ago, under the command of Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper, the U.S. military war-gamed a preemptive strike and invasion of Iran.
And what happened when they ran the numbers on that?
Well, the U.S. forces were absolutely decimated.
Really?
Yeah. The Red Team, which was the side playing Iran, commanded by Van Riper, they used asymmetrical tactics. They knew they couldn't beat the U.S. in a traditional fight, so they got creative.
What kind of tactics?
They used motorcycle messengers to completely bypass the U.S.'s advanced electronic surveillance.
Oh, that's brilliant. You can't hack a guy on a dirt bike handing off a piece of paper.
Exactly. And they used swarms of small, really fast boats to overwhelm the massive, high-tech U.S. naval vessels. The simulation showed them sinking a significant portion of the U.S. fleet in just the opening days.
Which I'm guessing didn't go over very well with the brass.
Not at all. The source notes that the defeat was so decisive and frankly embarrassing that leadership demanded they reset the board and run the war game a second time.
Wait, they just called a do-over?
Yep. And this time, they artificially restricted the Red Team, so the U.S. forces were basically guaranteed to win.
That is the ultimate cognitive dissonance. But the really terrifying context here is the timeline. That war game happened 2 decades ago.
Exactly. That was before Iran spent 20 years developing highly sophisticated asymmetric drone and missile capabilities.
Right. So if an invasion was a logistical disaster 20 years ago against a much weaker adversary, the source argues a ground war today would just be a catastrophic bloodbath.
Completely. But, war isn't just infantry and tanks anymore. It's electronic warfare. It's surveillance.
Yeah, and the text points to a specific glaring vulnerability in the high-tech U.S. arsenal that fundamentally shifts the balance of power before a single troop even deploys.
It focuses heavily on the early warning radar systems. The text states that Iran recently neutralized 5 multi-million-dollar U.S. radars located in neighboring countries.
And we aren't talking about cheap equipment here.
No, 2 of these systems were reportedly worth $500 million each.
$500 million for a single radar. I mean, we are talking about massive, incredibly complex arrays.
Right. These are active electronically scanned array systems. They are the eyes of the U.S. military in the region. They are capable of tracking everything from aircraft to incoming ballistic missiles. And the source notes that, with these destroyed, the U.S. is essentially left blind in crucial sectors. But the true crisis isn't just that they were destroyed.
It's that they can't replace them.
Exactly. The U.S. cannot readily replace them.
Okay, wait, that doesn't track for me. We spend nearly $1 trillion a year on defense. We have the most lucrative defense contractors on the planet. Why can't we just spin up the factories and build 5 new radars?
Because you can't build a radar out of money. You have to build it out of physical materials.
Right.
Specifically gallium. It's a rare earth metal that is an absolute non-negotiable requirement for manufacturing these advanced radar semiconductors.
Why gallium specifically?
They require gallium nitride components to handle the extreme heat and power of modern electronic warfare. Older silicon chips just melt or fail under those conditions.
Okay, so we need gallium. And where does the gallium come from?
According to the source, China controls roughly 98% of the global refining capacity for gallium.
98%. That is incredible. Okay, let's unpack this for a second. So, relying on China to fix radars blown up by Iran, that's like buying a billion-dollar security system for your house. But the only guy who has the spare parts is the rival you just locked out of the building.
It's a profound geopolitical bottleneck, and we really need to be precise about what refining means in this context.
Yeah, clarify that.
It's not just about who has the raw rocks in the ground. The U.S. actually has rare earth deposits, but the process of extracting and refining those metals into military-grade components is heavily toxic, incredibly complex, and requires massive industrial infrastructure.
So we just didn't want to deal with it.
Essentially, yes. The U.S. outsourced that dirty, expensive work to China over the last 30 years to save money and avoid environmental issues.
So the U.S. administration is aggressively posturing against Iran. But to fight that war, to rebuild the eyes of its military, it would effectively have to beg Beijing, its primary global rival, to keep the supply chain open.
The source mentions the pure absurdity of leadership canceling a diplomatic meeting with China while simultaneously advocating for war with Iran. It demonstrates a complete disconnect between political ambition and supply chain reality.
It really does.
And for you listening, this gallium choke point isn't just some abstract military secret. This mirrors the exact vulnerabilities in the civilian tech you use every single day.
Like our phones.
Exactly. The microchips in your laptop, the sensors in your electric vehicle, they are tethered to these exact same monopolized refining networks.
So if a land invasion is geographical suicide, and your land-based radar surveillance is blinded by a supply chain you don't control, the conventional military playbook is shrinking rapidly. The conflict is basically forced off the land and onto the water.
Which brings us to the ghosts of the Persian Gulf and the historical nightmare of operating in the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. The Strait of Hormuz is essentially the jugular vein of the global economy. A massive percentage of the world's oil flows through a channel that is just shockingly narrow.
The deep draft shipping lanes that those massive supertankers require are only about 2 miles wide in either direction. It is the ultimate maritime choke point.
2 miles is nothing for ships that size.
It's practically a puddle for them.
And the source notes that the administration has really vacillated on how to handle this. One moment they say they need a huge international coalition to force the strait open, and the next moment they claim the U.S. Navy can just handle it unilaterally.
Right, and that overconfidence ignores a very bloody history. The source explicitly points back to the 1980s, specifically Operation Earnest Will and Operation Praying Mantis, to illustrate how incredibly difficult it is to project power in those waters.
I really want to dig into that history because it provides the exact mechanical context for why the Navy is so vulnerable there. What was Operation Earnest Will?
So during the Iran-Iraq War, the waters of the Gulf essentially became a free fire zone for commercial shipping. To protect the global oil supply, the U.S. implemented a policy of reflagging.
Reflagging, meaning what?
They took Kuwaiti oil tankers and officially registered them as U.S. vessels, flying the American flag. The strategic logic was that Iran wouldn't dare attack a ship flying the Stars and Stripes because it would invite the full wrath of the U.S. military.
So they tried to use the flag as like a magical protective shield?
Yes. And to back it up, the U.S. Navy provided armed escorts. But the geography completely betrayed them. The channels are so tight and the water is so shallow in places that Iran didn't even need a sophisticated navy to fight back.
What did they use?
Naval mines. You don't even need a warship to deploy them. You can literally drop them off the back of a civilian speedboat in the dead of night.
Oh, wow. And it worked.
It did. The source mentions a ship called the Bridgerton.
Right.
The MV Bridgerton was this massive supertanker, one of the first to be escorted under this new policy. It hit an Iranian mine right in the main shipping channel. The explosion blew a massive hole in its hull.
But the Bridgerton was a commercial vessel, even if it was reflagged. Did the military itself take a hit?
They did. The text highlights the fate of the USS Samuel B. Roberts.
A Navy ship?
Yes, a guided missile frigate. A multi-million-dollar U.S. warship struck a contact mine. The explosion broke the ship's keel and nearly sank it.
Broke the keel. That's usually a death sentence for a ship.
It is. The crew barely kept it afloat, and the source vividly describes how it had to limp its way back to port at an agonizingly slow speed of just 4 knots.
So the U.S. retaliated, obviously. That led to Operation Praying Mantis.
Correct. The U.S. struck back with overwhelming force. They attacked Iranian oil platforms that were being used as radar bases, and when the Iranian Navy responded, the U.S. sank several of their ships.
Right. The text mentions putting a laser-guided bomb right down the smokestack of an Iranian frigate.
It was a decisive tactical victory, but the source points out that President Ronald Reagan ultimately called the operation off. He realized that continuing to escalate in that confined space was just too volatile.
And here is the crucial takeaway from that history. In the 1980s, the U.S. had total, unquestioned naval supremacy. They were fighting in Iran that was completely exhausted from a massive war with Iraq and using really rudimentary sea mines, and it was still a chaotic, incredibly dangerous mess.
Which is exactly what makes the present day so alarming. The source notes that today's Iran possesses capabilities that make those 1980s sea mines look like children's toys.
Right. The text specifically highlights Iran's inventory of advanced ballistic missiles. We are talking about weapons that move at Mach 3, Mach 4, even Mach 5.
Hypersonic and near hypersonic speeds.
Let's explain why speed matters so much in naval defense. I mean, Mach 5 is what, like a mile a second?
Roughly, yeah, over 3,800 miles per hour. Modern naval defense relies on tracking an incoming threat, calculating its trajectory, and then firing an interceptor to destroy it midair.
Right.
When a missile is traveling at Mach 5, the reaction window for a ship's automated defense systems shrinks to mere seconds. Furthermore, some of these modern missiles can actually maneuver during their terminal phase.
So they aren't just flying in a predictable arc. They are actively dodging.
Exactly. They skip and maneuver, making it incredibly difficult for the Aegis combat systems on U.S. destroyers to get a firm lock on them.
Wow.
And the source warns these are fully fledged warheads, capable of disabling or even sinking modern aircraft carriers. It explicitly names the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford.
So if you are the admiral of a carrier strike group, and you know the enemy has a battery of Mach 5 missiles that you might not be able to shoot down, you can't park your $13 billion aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf.
You absolutely cannot. You keep it hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away in the Arabian Sea.
Which completely neutralizes the carrier's primary function, which is projecting close air support.
Right, and this brings us to a very controversial claim in the source material. It argues that despite the massive budget, the U.S. military has actually atrophied over the last 30 years.
Atrophied is a really strong word for a military that spends that much money. Where exactly is that atrophy happening?
Well, the source suggests that while the U.S. has invested in hyper-sophisticated technology, that very sophistication has created crippling systemic fragility. And the prime example the text uses is the F-35 fighter jet.
The single most expensive weapons program in the history of human warfare.
Yes. The text cites a staggering operational metric for the F-35A, B, and C models. They require roughly 30 hours of maintenance time for every single hour of flight time.
30 hours in the shop for 1 hour in the air. How is that functionally a weapon of war?
It really becomes a logistical anchor, and the source points out that a massive reason for this bottleneck is purely corporate.
Wait, corporate?
Yeah. Lockheed Martin, the primary contractor, designed the aircraft with a proprietary maintenance infrastructure. The internal software, which is historically known as ALES, Autonomic Logistics Information System, essentially locks the military out of its own planes.
Okay, so it's the right to repair debate, but scaled up to global warfare.
That is exactly what it is.
I mean, if you've ever been infuriated because you couldn't replace the battery in your smartphone yourself, or if you know a farmer who has a $500,000 tractor sitting idle because the manufacturer's software won't let them swap a basic part without a licensed technician, that is the exact same corporate monopoly friction currently grounding U.S. fighter squadrons.
You've nailed it. Military mechanics on the flight deck often cannot clear a jet for takeoff, even if they physically fixed the mechanical issue, because the proprietary software has to phone home to a centralized server, which is often managed by the contractor, just to clear the error codes.
That is insane. So when the source says these jets are flying, but they aren't quote-unquote fully mission capable, what does that mean practically in a combat scenario?
It means they might be able to take off and drop a bomb, but the hyper-advanced interconnected battlefield network they were designed to provide, the stealth data links, the sensor fuse, it just isn't functioning reliably. The source notes that the Marines are often the most pragmatic about this. They'll fly a jet if it simply gets off the ground. But a jet that is only partially functioning in a high-threat environment is a huge liability.
So let's look at the board so far. A ground invasion is out. The Navy is pushed out of the Gulf by Mach 5 missiles. The Air Force is bogged down by proprietary software and insane maintenance backlogs. What does the military do when it can't maneuver? It relies on brute force from a distance. Bombing campaigns.
And the source argues that relying on massive aerial bombardment isn't just a moral hazard, it is a fundamental tactical failure.
We've seen this historically, right? The expectation from leadership is always that if you bomb an adversary's infrastructure and civilian centers hard enough, the population will break. They will overthrow their own government just to make the pain stop.
Right. But the text references testimony from a 4-star Air Force general to Congress, explaining that the psychological reality is the exact opposite. Heavy bombardment doesn't fracture a society. It fuses them.
Fuses them.
Yes. Think of the London Blitz during World War II. Bombing a city doesn't make the citizens turn on their leaders. It makes them fiercely, fiercely unified against the attacker.
Even if they didn't like their leaders to begin with.
Exactly. Even if a population currently despises their own government, the moment foreign bombs start dropping on their neighborhoods, those internal political divisions just evaporate.
They tighten up.
They become incredibly resolute. The source asserts that a fused population will fight to the bitter death. They will absorb immense suffering to repel the invader. Therefore, the administration's fantasy of a short war, which is predicated on a quick collapse of Iranian morale, is totally disconnected from human psychology.
So the conventional playbook is entirely empty. You can't invade, you can't sail in, you can't sustain the air war, and bombing only makes the enemy stronger. But the administration is locked into an all-or-nothing posture. They need a spectacular victory. So when a nuclear power runs out of conventional options but refuses to lose, what do they reach for?
And this is where the source material enters its darkest analysis. It explicitly raises the specter of Israel utilizing the Samson option.
The deployment of nuclear weapons to bring down the temple on everyone's heads.
Right. But even here, the source grounds the terror in cold geographical math.
Because a single nuclear weapon doesn't solve the tactical problem, right?
No, Iran isn't a tiny island nation. The source points out that Iran's landmass is roughly equivalent to the entirety of Western Europe.
We really need to visualize that scale for a second. Iran stretches the equivalent distance of New York to Colorado. It is vast, it's mountainous, and it's heavily decentralized.
Exactly. So if you detonate a tactical nuclear weapon over a single military installation, yes, you cause horrific localized devastation, but you don't stop the country.
Because the Iranian military apparatus is deeply buried in mountain bunkers spread across thousands of miles.
So dropping one nuke is almost like dropping a pin in the Pacific.
Wow. It's horrifying to think that the sheer vastness of a country's landmass is what necessitates a multiple nuclear strike scenario.
Yeah. The geopolitical math dictates that to achieve a true strategic knockout blow, to actually paralyze a country of that size, you would need a massive coordinated strike. The source estimates it would require 10, 12, perhaps even 20 nuclear weapons detonated simultaneously across various targets.
20. It's unfathomable. But the text claims Israel possesses the physical capability to execute that.
It does. The source estimates their undeclared nuclear arsenal sits somewhere between 200 and 300 weapons, consisting of free-flying bombs and submarine-launched warheads.
So the inventory is there.
The inventory is absolutely there.
But surely there are guardrails. I mean, the whole global order is built on the assumption that nobody will actually use these things.
Right, and the source looks back at history again to analyze the threshold for launching a nuclear strike. It references a very vivid anecdote from 1973 involving Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and a BBC reporter.
A famous Red Roses story.
Yes. So the reporter supposedly sent her 24 red roses to secure an exclusive phone interview during the really intense days of the Yom Kippur War.
And what happened on the call?
During that call, he bypassed the pleasantries and just bluntly asked if she would use a nuclear weapon to save the state if the conventional war was lost. Her response, reportedly without a moment's hesitation, was a flat yes.
Just yes.
Just yes.
But the text provides critical context for why she said that, right? It wasn't just a blind threat, it was calculated leverage.
Exactly. In 1973, the world was locked in the Cold War binary. You had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Golda Meir knew that U.S. and Soviet intelligence were listening to that call.
Okay.
By stating she was ready to use the bomb, she was forcing the superpowers to intervene. It was a strategic leak. She was trying to force the U.S. to airlift conventional supplies and force the Soviets to restrain their Arab allies so she wouldn't have to actually drop the bomb.
So the threat of the weapon was the tool, not the weapon itself. The superpowers were the guardrails keeping the genie in the bottle.
But the source argues that the geopolitical dynamic today is fundamentally different and infinitely more dangerous, because those Cold War guardrails are entirely gone.
The text explicitly states that Prime Minister Netanyahu is, quote, on his own.
He is completely unconstrained by that superpower tension. The Soviet Union doesn't exist to balance the equation, and the U.S., according to the source, lacks the leverage or the will to restrain him.
Wait, I really had to challenge the mechanics of this.
Yeah.
The force suggests that an allied nation would unilaterally launch a dozen nuclear weapons without the U.S. intelligence apparatus catching wind, or the U.S. president stepping in to stop it.
Is that a realistic reading of military chain of command? Doesn't the U.S. have ultimate veto power over an ally's nuclear posture?
Legally and operationally, no. Israel's nuclear program is sovereign and deeply, deeply secretive.
Okay.
The source asserts that Netanyahu maintains a tight, fiercely loyal chain of command within his military apparatus. If the order was given, the text argues it would be executed rapidly, and the U.S. leadership would likely find out exactly when the rest of the world does, which is when the missile warning systems light up and the mushroom clouds rise.
Exactly.
That's chilling. And while this nuclear sword of Damocles hangs over the region, what is the diplomatic reality? Is the U.S. building some massive global coalition to manage the crisis?
The exact opposite. The source details a rapid and total diplomatic exodus. The U.S. is becoming profoundly isolated.
What about the Gulf states? They have a historical rivalry with Iran.
The text claims they want absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. As soon as they realize the U.S. cannot guarantee a swift, clean victory, they will distance themselves completely to protect their own infrastructure.
And Europe.
Europe is backing away rapidly. The source cites Spain as leading the political charge away from U.S. policy, driven by a mix of ethical concerns and cold, realpolitik.
Right.
The overarching message from European allies is really clear. We are not going down this road with you.
And it's not just political distancing. There's active legal action being taken.
Yes, the source points to the International Court of Justice. It notes a mounting wave of international legal cases being brought against Israel for its regional actions. The text predicts we could see a unified bloc of up to 50 states legally condemning the actions of the U.S.'s primary ally.
So to summarize the board again, a military quagmire, the specter of unilateral nuclear war, and total diplomatic isolation. The only allies left, according to the text, are the U.S. Navy and the British Navy, which the source actually insultingly dismisses as a sandbox navy.
Yeah, the wording is pretty harsh.
Let's translate this to the listener's reality. If a rumor, just an unconfirmed rumor, of a nuclear launch in the Middle East hits the wires, what happens in the next 10 minutes?
Absolute, instantaneous global panic. I mean, the stock markets don't just dip, they crash violently. Trading is halted. Global maritime insurance rates spike to levels that make shipping financially impossible.
Meaning the global supply chain literally freezes in place.
The ships carrying your electronics, your winter clothes, your automotive parts, they drop anchor and wait.
Because they can't afford to move.
Right. The price of energy skyrockets, taking the cost of every transported good up with it. The retirement accounts and pensions tied to global stability hemorrhage value. The isolation of the U.S. creates an environment where extreme actions become plausible, and markets hate nothing more than catastrophic unpredictability.
Which really forces us to look inward. Because if the U.S. is isolated abroad, fighting a multi-front, high-attrition war, how does it physically sustain the fight from home? The source pivots to the domestic American reality, and frankly, the logistics are just as bleak.
It really starts with the most fundamental element of warfare: ammunition.
The administration might project an image of endless stockpiles, but the text categorically calls that a falsehood.
You cannot fight a high-intensity, peer-level conflict with the current U.S. inventory. The burn rate of precision munitions in modern warfare is just staggering.
But again, why can't we just mandate the defense industry to build more? I mean, we have Raytheon, Lockheed, Boeing.
Because of how the defense industry has restructured itself since the end of the Cold War.
Okay, how so?
The text uses really harsh language here, referring to defense contractor leadership as grifting idiots focused on quarterly profits over national readiness.
Trying to start a major war, while relying on a defense industry that needs 3 years to build your missiles is like jumping out of an airplane and hoping you can sew the parachute together before you hit the ground.
That's a great way to put it. Let's explain the mechanics of that. Since the 90s, the Pentagon essentially adopted a just-in-time supply chain model.
Kind of like Amazon.
Exactly like Amazon. You only order exactly what you need for the next few months to save money on warehousing. But in a major war, you don't need Amazon. You need Costco. You need massive, dusty warehouses full of surplus missiles. And we dismantled those warehouses 30 years ago.
So there's no backup supply.
Right. That is exactly the structural flaw. If the military suddenly demands a massive surge in Tomahawk cruise missiles, the source estimates it would take the defense base 1 to 2 years just to spin up the production lines and source the subcomponents.
And what about defensive systems? Because the text mentions the THAAD.
Right. THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It's an incredibly advanced anti-ballistic missile system. It uses kinetic hit-to-kill technology.
Meaning it doesn't have an explosive warhead? It literally rams into the incoming missile in the stratosphere.
It's the equivalent of hitting a bullet with a bullet while both are traveling at thousands of miles per hour.
That's wild.
The engineering required for the seekers and the propulsion is phenomenally complex. Because of that complexity, the source notes that getting THAAD production up to the required rate would take 2 to 3 years.
So there's a massive multi-year window where the military is burning through its reserves with virtually no resupply. But machines are really only half the equation. You need humans. And this is where the source drops a word that changes the fabric of American society. Conscription. The draft.
Right.
The text argues that a sustained war of this magnitude, with the inevitable casualties and required troop rotations, would absolutely necessitate a full mobilization of the American populace. But we have the selective service system. Every 18-year-old male registers. Isn't the mechanism already there?
The database exists, but the source claims the actual physical and administrative apparatus required to execute a draft is fundamentally broken.
Broken how?
It cites an internal study indicating that just to get the system operational, to fix the databases, establish the draft boards, and process the medical exemptions would cost upwards of $100 million and take 6 to 10 months.
And that's assuming everything runs perfectly.
Exactly. The text notes that even if they ran double or triple shifts, working 24 hours a day, it would be nearly a year before the first newly trained draftee could actually be deployed.
But let's look at the societal reaction to this. The source predicts mass evasion. It claims that half of all 18 to 24-year-olds would simply disappear, fleeing to Canada or Mexico.
It paints a picture of total generational revolt against the war effort.
I really have to question the logistics of that, though. The source claims half of American youth would flee to Canada or Mexico to dodge a draft. But in an era of digital surveillance, biometric passports, facial recognition at border controls, is a mass 1960s-style draft evasion even logistically possible today?
It's a highly valid point regarding the physical logistics of evasion. The source may be leaning into hyperbole a bit to illustrate a deeper truth.
Which is what?
The absolute absence of political and social will, even if they can't physically cross the border, the sheer friction of a population that refuses to comply, people who tie up the legal system with conscientious objector claims, who protest at the induction centers, it would completely paralyze the system.
I want you to think about the impact on your own community. Imagine the economic disruption of pulling millions of young people out of the workforce, out of universities. Imagine the societal tear in the fabric of families. The domestic front would be a war zone of its own.
And that profound friction isn't just happening in the streets. It is happening inside the highest levels of the Pentagon. The source gives us a glimpse into the fierce internal dissent between the professional military class and the political leadership.
The text mentions a specific legal provision regarding how military advice reaches the president. What is that about?
Yes, it outlines a mechanism established during Colin Powell's tenure as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. By law, the chairman is the primary military advisor to the president and the National Security Council. They operate on the same legal tier as the Secretary of Defense.
This means the military doesn't have to filter its tactical warnings through a civilian political appointee who might soften the bad news. They can go straight to the Oval Office.
Precisely. It was specifically designed to ensure the president hears the unvarnished military reality. And the source claims that professional officers, like General Jack Keane, have forcefully pushed back against the administration's war plans, laying out the exact logistical nightmares we've been discussing.
And how does the political leadership respond to being told their plan is functionally impossible?
By removing the messengers, the text alleges that a three-star Navy admiral, the director of the Joint Staff, the J3 operational lead, was actually fired and sent back to the fleet specifically for voicing dissent and pointing out the flaws in the strategy.
Wow. Fired for doing his job and protecting his sailors.
And despite this mechanism for direct advice, the source claims the president simply ignores the warnings of the Joint Chiefs. The political apparatus is entirely locked into its narrative.
But why? If the tactical math is so clearly pointing toward disaster, what is driving the leadership forward? The source points to something much deeper and more volatile than bad strategy: religion and apocalyptic ideology.
This is perhaps one of the most chilling details in the entire transcript. The source describes a situation where the Secretary of Defense hosted a St. Patrick's Day Christian prayer service inside the Pentagon.
Inside the command center of the U.S. military.
Yes. And it's not just about the service itself, it's about the framing of the conflict. The text notes that elements of the leadership view this potential war through the lens of a holy crusade, or an Armageddon end times mission.
Which fundamentally corrupts the military mission.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot fight a calculated strategic war if your leadership believes they are fulfilling biblical prophecy.
The source mentions receiving communication from a highly articulate military contractor deployed in the Middle East. This contractor was deeply irritated and alienated by having to sit through operational meetings where the campaign was explicitly discussed as being, quote, for God and Jesus.
It creates massive cognitive dissonance. The official narrative is usually about bringing democracy or neutralizing a dangerous theocracy in Iran. But you can't defeat a theocracy by launching your own apocalyptic crusade. You alienate your allies, you alienate your own troops, and you lose any claim to strategic rationality.
Which is precisely the contrast the source makes. It argues that in this scenario, the Iranian leadership is actually the party acting with, quote, quintessential rationality.
That completely flips the standard narrative we hear about irrational zealots. How is Iran acting rationally?
By calculating risk precisely. The source points out that Iran uses precise targeting for its strikes to avoid unnecessary escalation. It even notes their willingness to quietly apologize to neighboring Gulf nations if a drone strike accidentally damages unintended civilian infrastructure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are playing a cold, calculated game of survival, whereas the U.S. leadership, according to the text, is driven by ego, defense industry grift, and apocalyptic fervor.
So we have a military that cannot maneuver, a defense base that cannot supply ammunition, a populace that will revolt against a draft, and a leadership blinded by ideology. What is the ultimate outcome of all these cascading failures?
This brings us to the final, most sweeping conclusion of the source material. It's not just about losing a war in the Middle East, it's about the permanent end of American grand strategy and maritime dominance.
But understand this, the source says we have to look at immutable geography. The text states very clearly, we are a maritime nation.
Right. And since the end of the Second World War, the United States has maintained global hegemony primarily through its control of the oceans. The U.S. Navy guarantees the safety of global sea lanes, and in return, the global economy operates on American terms.
But the source contrasts this sea power dominance with two major geopolitical frameworks. First, Helford Mackinder's heartland theory.
Mackinder was a geographer in the early 20th century. He observed the rapid expansion of Russian transcontinental railroads. His theory warned that if a unified power could effectively connect the vast interior of the Eurasian landmass by rail, it could move troops and resources internally, completely immune to the power of a navy.
It would render maritime empires completely irrelevant. The fear that iron rails over dirt would ultimately defeat wooden ships over water.
Exactly, and the source pairs this with a modern historical perspective from Peter Frankopan's book, The Silk Roads. Frankopan points out that this has happened before.
Really?
Yes. Historically powerful internal empires, like the ancient Persian land routes, were able to completely disrupt maritime powers, like the Portuguese seafarers, simply by shifting global trade to overland caravans, which were cheaper and entirely safe from naval harassment.
So the precedent is there, and the source argues this exact dynamic is being intentionally recreated right now.
Yes. The text points to massive, modern infrastructure megaprojects designed to stitch the Eurasian landmass together. Specifically, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and the Russian-Iranian-Indian International North-South Transportation Corridor.
Let's break down the mechanics of that corridor. What does it actually look like?
It is a massive multimodal network. We are talking about high-speed rail lines stretching across the steppes, massive new highway systems, and integrated inland waterways connecting the ports of Russia down through the Iranian landmass straight to the Indian Ocean and linking up with China's east-west trade arteries.
It's an entirely self-contained economic ecosystem. It's as if the U.S. owns the most powerful, heavily armed toll booths on the ocean, and Eurasia just decided to build a massive high-speed rail network completely out of sight of the water.
That is the perfect analogy. If the U.S. Navy's presence makes the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea too volatile for commercial shipping, global trade simply shifts inland. And if the physical flow of goods shifts inland, the U.S. Navy, the primary instrument of American global power, becomes increasingly irrelevant to the daily functioning of global commerce.
But I have to push back a little on relying heavily on 19th and 20th century theories like Mackinder's. I mean, we are looking at the year 2026. We live in an era of global satellite internet, cloud computing, digital economies, and AI. Does controlling physical dirt roads and railways really dictate global supremacy the way it did during the ancient Silk Road? Doesn't digital tech supersede physical geography?
The digital economy is vital, definitely, but the physical economy is foundational. You cannot download a barrel of oil. You cannot 3D print gallium out of thin air. You cannot digitize the thousands of tons of grain required to feed a population.
Fair point.
The physical flow of hard commodities is still the bedrock of human civilization. And the source argues that this physical land-based integration is being deliberately paired with a massive financial decoupling.
Right. The text brings up Chinese President Xi Jinping and a strategic shift away from the U.S. dollar.
This is the lethal blow to U.S. hegemony. The source states that Xi is actively moving to dismantle the Bretton Woods system, the post-World War II financial architecture that cemented the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency.
And specifically, moving away from SWIFT. Let's explain what SWIFT actually is for a second.
SWIFT is essentially the global messaging system that banks use to securely transfer money across borders. Because it is heavily influenced by the West, the U.S. has weaponized it, cutting adversary nations out of the system to isolate them financially.
So China is building an alternative plumbing system for global finance. They want to push the renminbi to replace the U.S. dollar in bilateral trade.
Yes. But the text notes this wasn't an easy or obvious decision for China.
It mentions that scholars at their Central Party school actually warned Xi against doing this.
Because they view global financial hegemony as an, quote, empire destroyer.
Wow, why?
The logic is fascinating. When your currency is the global reserve, everyone needs it. This artificially props up your economy and allows you to live perpetually on debt, relying on the hard work and manufacturing of other nations to finance your deficits. The Chinese scholars see this reliance on financial manipulation rather than physical production as the exact rot that is destroying the U.S. from the inside.
They didn't want China to catch the same disease.
Exactly. But despite those warnings, the source says Xi has bit the bullet to defeat the U.S.
And the ultimate tragic irony highlighted by the source is that U.S. policy itself is what forged this new Eurasian alliance.
Yes. The text points out that for centuries, there was deep, bitter historical antagonism between Russia and China and between Russia and Iran. They did not trust each other.
Right.
But the aggressive posturing, the endless economic sanctions, and the military threats from the United States have essentially forced these thousand-year historical rivals into a tight, unified bloc.
American foreign policy achieved the exact opposite of its strategic goals. It gave its enemies a reason to unite.
The source uses a striking phrase referring to the architects of this new economic order as the, quote, Rothschilds of the present world.
Meaning they hold the ultimate financial and logistical power.
The text calculates that this new Eurasian bloc, especially if they fully integrate with massive resource economies like Brazil and Canada, represents roughly 75 to 77% of the global population and natural resources.
The math on that is staggering. It means they don't actually need the United States to survive.
Not at all. They can create a completely self-sufficient, highly functional global economy while completely ostracizing the U.S. All the massive advantages the U.S. has enjoyed for 2 centuries, two oceans protecting its borders, and absolute economic dominance could be wiped out simply by being ignored, by being completely bypassed.
And this brings it all back home to you, the listener. Because if this Eurasian land bridge solidifies and global trade actively de-dollarizes, we are talking about a fundamental, permanent drop in your standard of living. When the dollar loses its reserve status, its purchasing power plummets. Everything imported from your clothes to your car parts becomes astronomically expensive.
Inflation becomes a permanent structural reality, not just a temporary spike.
It is a slow, invisible erosion of American prosperity.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of a massive corporation going bankrupt. It happens very gradually over decades of bad decisions, and then suddenly, all at once.
Man, what a dense and illuminating web this source material has provided today. We started this deep dive looking at the tactical impossibility of landing Marines on Karg Island in the Persian Gulf. We examined the massive vulnerability of our early warning radars because of a monopolized gallium supply chain from China.
We broke down the historical nightmares of naval operations in the Strait of Hormuz and how hypersonic missiles and the crippling proprietary maintenance software of the F-35 have left the modern military atrophied and devoid of conventional options.
We looked at the terrifying geopolitical math of the Samson Option, why a country the size of Western Europe requires a multi-warhead nuclear strike, and how the collapse of the Cold War guardrails leaves leaders unconstrained in a diplomatically isolated world.
We explored the domestic collapse, too. The realization that our just-in-time defense base needs years to build the ad systems, the logistical nightmare of reviving a broken conscription system, and a political leadership blinded by apocalyptic ideology, ignoring the stark warnings of its own military professionals.
And finally, we zoomed out to see the grandest shift of all, the pivot from American maritime dominance to an integrated Eurasian land power, moving trade over iron rails and bypassing the oceans and the U.S. dollar entirely.
It is a comprehensive anatomy of systemic, cascading strategic failure.
Now, before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought, something to mull over that builds on everything we've just unpacked. If the United States truly retreats from the Middle East, and this Eurasian land bridge, this massive Russia-China-Iran corridor, becomes the new physical and financial center of the world, what happens to the cultural export of the West?
That is a brilliant question, because for the last century, American maritime and financial dominance meant that American culture, our movies, our music, our democratic ideals, our fashion, it all flowed into every port on Earth right alongside the shipping containers.
Exactly. Culture follows cargo. If the physical trade routes shift entirely inland, permanently bypassing the Western ports, does the cultural compass of the entire globe inevitably follow the cargo? In 50 years, if the global economy operates on the renminbi over Eurasian rails, will the world still be looking to American culture? Or will the cultural and ideological center of gravity have shifted to Eurasia right alongside the economic power?
It really forces us to ask if American soft power can exist without American hard power backing it up.
Geopolitics isn't a clean, simple X-ray. It's an infinitely complex, interconnected web. Pulling one tactical thread in the Strait of Hormuz can eventually unravel the value of the money in your pocket and the movies playing on screens across the globe. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the narratives you are handed, look past the immediate headlines to the underlying mechanics, and keep exploring the rapidly shifting maps of our world. We'll see you next time.